Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful day. I think we will compete favorably with the weather. I really appreciate your taking the time. My name is Laura Heisler. I am the Director of Programming for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, and I am delighted to welcome you to the first of a mini-series of 4 sessions that we're holding this fall to commemorate 90 years of partnership between the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation and UW-Madison. As you may know, WARF is a nonprofit foundation that patents and commercializes inventions that come from research done here at UW-Madison. And that sounds pretty straightforward, but our collaborative work with the university isn't always straightforward, and it's becoming a critical piece of how the state of Wisconsin views the work that takes place here at UW, and in fact, if today's headlines are any indication, how some things unfold on a much broader stage. WARF was established in 1925 to advance the groundbreaking research along with graduate education here at UW-Madison. And we do that through financial, intellectual, and legal support to university partners. And our staff are privileged to work with these partners on a regular basis and to do so in the spirit in which WARF was originally founded. This forum that we're having today and the next 4 are each designed to showcase one element of what we call the cycle of innovation that describes our relationship with UW-Madison. And we really do feel that this proceeds in the way that it was envisioned from the very outset. It all starts, of course, with research, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, the rationale for basic research. Research, of course, leads to discovery and invention by campus faculty and researchers. And then WARF steps in at that point to help commercialize technologies, bring them to the marketplace where they can actually impact people. And then, of course, the proceeds that come from that commercialization are reinvested into the university to promote and support further research. It's a beautiful evergreen cycle. It works now much as it did 90 years ago. So we're going to be looking at each element as a different session. So very briefly, I just want to prime the pump for you to look at what's coming ahead. Next week, on Thursday, as part of the Wisconsin Science Festival, actually we'll be taking a close look at the discovery and invention process. Former Chancellor John Wiley will be moderating that session with some of the most preeminent inventors on the UW-Madison campus, including Hector DeLuca. We're sitting in the room named for Hector DeLuca. Guri Sohi, who has been much in the news lately from the computer science department, Laura Kiesling from the chemistry department, and a younger, newer inventor who has a really exciting startup, Dan Ludis from engineering. So you might want to catch that session. A couple of weeks later, we'll be looking at the technology commercialization process. Kevin Conroy from Exact Sciences, another name that's been in the news lately, will be moderating that discussion with partners from both GE Medical and campus to highlight that longstanding partnership, as well as Winslow Sargent, the former chief counsel to the Small Business Administration, the Obama administration, and Stephanie Adamani, WARF's Associate Legal Counsel. And then finally, on November 18th, we'll be holding a discussion between Managing Director of WARF, Carl Gulbranson, and Marcia Malik, Vice Chancellor for Research and Graduate Education, to discuss what the longstanding relationship and the investment in the university has meant to UW-Madison over the past 90 years. So that's our series in brief. And with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Kevin Walters, who is WARF's historian in residence, to give you some perspective on how all of this unfolded and what events took place 90 years ago to set the stage for what we'll be talking about today.
Thanks, Laura. As she said, she asked me to give some historical background on WARF and how basic research contributed to the formation of WARF's mission. So when I started thinking about this, and actually when I looked at this cycle, I realized something that I hadn't actually realized before. Here's the original Articles of Organization for WARF, written first in 1925. I went back and took a picture of the original document because as an historian, I don't think anything really means anything unless the paper has gotten brown. But this is the original. The mission statement now, it's been updated a few times. The laws have changed, and it's been amended to make sure that it matches the laws a little bit. Also, the biggest change is that WARF is now supporting both University of Wisconsin-Madison rather than University of Wisconsin, as it was called back then, and it also supports the Mortgage Institute for Research, which did not exist back in 1925. Other than that, though, this language is pretty close to what WARF's mission statement is today. And what I noticed is that the cycle of innovation is actually in there. I didn't really notice this really until just a couple of days ago, so I'll go ahead and read it. The business and purpose of the corporation shall be to promote, encourage, and aid scientific investigation and research at the University of Wisconsin by the faculty, staff, alumni, and students thereof, and those associated therewith, and to provide or assist in providing the means and machinery by which their scientific discoveries, inventions, and processes may be developed, applied and patented in the public and commercial uses, commercial, therefore determined, and by which such utilizations or descriptions may be made of each such discoveries, inventions, and processes, and patent rights or interests therein, and may tend to stimulate and promote and provide funds for scientific investigation and research. So investment isn't in there, so the investment team might have to look into a name change. But other than that, you have the 4 words right there embedded in it. That's a long sentence. There's a lot to unpack, so fortunately I have 4 different of these presentations to try to explain that sentence. I think if a student of mine wrote a sentence like that, there'd be just as much ink on their paper as there is here. But for now, we're just going to zero in on that first sentence, which is to promote, encourage, and aid scientific investigation and research at the University of Wisconsin by the faculty, staff, alumni, and students therewith. So what does that mean exactly? And what did the founders of WARF mean when they wrote that sentence? Well, fortunately, I went back and found a couple quotes by a couple of the founders of WARF to explain that. So here's Harry Steenbach. Inasmuch as a university is not primarily a money-making institution, it should not be expected to finance its research. But when the state fails to have the intelligence so to do, it is necessary for some agency, and by that he meant WARF, to carry on a campaign of education by way of showing what university can do. So I love that quote because it's quintessential Steenbach. He was he took no prisoners when it came to critics, but he was also unfailingly polite. He didn't call them stupid, although that's what he meant. He said, when you fail to have the intelligence to do so, I'm just going to go do it myself. I'm going to create a foundation, and we're going to use our science to fund the future scientists. Right? So here's another one, which is remarkably similar by Harry Russell. I actually shortened this a little bit. But you see there, the state should support fundamental research as fully and freely as any endowed foundation. But the demands are so numerous, and the difficulty of educating the legislature to a proper viewpoint is so great that the privately endowed institutions have the leverage over publicly endowed institutions. So what he was saying was that in the future, if we have to always go every year to convince the legislature to fund us, then places like Yale, places like the Rockefeller Foundation, they're going to get ahead of us. And so that was a problem. And so for him, his idea, he was actually writing this letter to an assistant dean of his who said, we're not really sure about this patenting thing, whether that's appropriate, whether that's the way we should do it. And he said, look, this isn't necessarily the way it should be. The state should fund basic research. But if they're not going to do it, then we have to step in. So that's how basic research played into the creation of WARF. But I want to highlight 2 of the assumptions that are in both of these quotes, which are pretty remarkably parallel each other. The first one, Harry Steenbach said that in 1940. Russell said that in 1926, and yet they're very close to each other. So the first assumption is they're not making an argument here in favor of basic research. They're assuming that. They're taking for granted that you should fund basic research. They're not explaining that. They're scientists. You should fund science because it's science. That's what we do. We're scientists. But the second part is that for some reason, it's really hard to explain that to people. It's really hard to convince people that they should do that. So you see that both of them are advocating and see WARF as a way to educate, as a way to say, this is why basic research is important. So that's what today's presentation is about, is to unpack the assumptions that are in both of these quotes and to understand how do we articulate those assumptions, what is it that makes basic research important, where does that come from, how does that work, and how has that developed in the past 90 years since these 2 guys were instrumental in founding WARF. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to the rest of our presenters.
So I am now delighted to introduce Nicole Nelson, who will be moderating the discussion and giving us a bit more context within which to understand the discussion that will follow. Nicole Nelson is assistant professor in the History of Science department here at UW-Madison. She studies the social dimensions of scientific work, such as interactions between scientific communities on the ways in which new technologies change scientists' work practices. Nicole has written on the development of the biolistic gene gun, the technology used to create the first transgenic crops, the introduction of sequencing technologies in the cancer clinic, and she is currently writing a book on animal models of psychiatric disorders. So delighted to welcome Nicole Nelson.
Thank you very much. Okay, let me just pop my slides up here. All right. right. So to open up the discussion, broaden out the discussion about the value of basic research and what that term means, I'm going to fast forward us now about 20 years in the future from where Kevin left us off and take us into the Second World War, where that term gains something of the meaning that we have for it today in terms of what we think of when we think of basic research. So World War II was known as the Physicists War, and it got this moniker both during the war and afterwards for a couple of different reasons. One was, of course, the role that the physical sciences and physical scientists and engineers played in technological advances that took place during that war. So on my left here, you've got an image here of two young Navy recruits who are using sonar to try and sound out the positions of submarines. Advances in sonar technology as well as radar technology were two very visible achievements that scientists and engineers helped contribute to in the Second World War. The atomic bomb, also a well-known achievement that physicists played a large role in. And the second reason that World War II gets this name, the Physicists War, is a little bit less well known today, but it's because during the war, in 1941, there was a large-scale effort to try and train military recruits in basic physics. So the second image that you see over here is actually a class of new recruits at MIT in the 1940s who are all taking introductory physics, which was considered at the time to be crucial to their training and their functioning in the military. So after the war, you have widespread support or widespread consensus around the idea that physical sciences, engineering, and science generally was crucial to the war effort, and a consensus that in some way the government should try and continue this momentum, that there should be some sort of federal support for science. The question was, how? In what form should this support be given, and why was it that the involvement of scientists during the war was so crucial? Was it because of the autonomy that researchers had at universities, which created a kind of intellectual reserve that the US government could draw on in times of crisis to mobilize for particular projects? Or was the fact that scientists were brought together in a mission-directed way by the government the key to the success of these technological advances? Was it because of their autonomy or because of that mission direction? Similarly, was physics education, like we see here, important because it taught these young recruits practical skills, like how to look through a scope and aim on the battlefield? Or was it because it taught them different ways of thinking that led them to be not just people who had pragmatic skills, but people who had a scientific way of approaching their mission? So this is the question that we get at the end of the Second World War. The rationale for basic research support is there, but what form should it take? Should it come in the form of mission-directed research, or should it come in the form of something that looks more like curiosity-driven research? The vision that ends up carrying the day comes from Vannevar Bush, an engineer who played a central role in the war effort as an inventor, as a project manager, and as a scientific advisor. And he publishes in 1945 a now very well-known report called Science, the Endless Frontier. I'm sure probably a lot of you have heard that phrase before. And in this report, he puts forward the argument for what he calls basic research. Basic research as a term had, of course, been there before, but this is really the place where that term starts to acquire something of its contemporary meaning. Rather than using the terms that we saw in some of Kevin's slides, like fundamental or pure research, which seemed to signal to people something that was more narrow and confined to university spaces, basic research seemed to signal something that you could build up from, something that would eventually lead to benefit for all. So Vannevar Bush, when he was reflecting back later on this report and the effect that he had and the importance of choosing that term, basic research, what he says was, that term allowed him to convey that work that had been regarded as by many people as interesting but hardly of any real impact on a practical existence had been basic to the production of a bomb that had ended a war. So basic research was a way for providing a rationale that kind of merged these two visions. You could have curiosity-driven research and independence and autonomy in universities, while at the same time leading to actual tangible things that would benefit the public at large. So this vision was enormously important in shaping the scientific system that we have today. It's important in founding the National Science Foundation, the NSF, that becomes a major benefactor of science, in expanding the mission of what was then the NIH into, again, becoming a major granting figure. And it creates generally an unprecedented level of support for STEM research here in the United States. But this vision that we get of what basic research is and why we should value it, I would argue, in some ways sells the value of basic research a little bit short. So first, it sets up a dichotomy between basic research and applied research, which I'm sure anybody who's got even a passing contact with science knows is not really true. There are many instances in which basic research leads to products, commercializable inventions, and in which applied research leads to insights into fundamental scientific questions. So that dichotomy doesn't really actually ring true to life in a lot of ways. But second, and I think more problematically, what the basic research vision does is it ties the value of basic research to its eventual application in products. So it says that we should value curiosity-driven research or research on fundamental questions because, in a roundabout way, that's going to get us to some sort of social benefit, even if it doesn't seem direct, even if it's not constrained by this sort of mission-oriented focus. But is that all really basic research gives us? And what happens if basic research doesn't produce a product or doesn't lead us to something like the bomb that ended the war? So what we wanted to do in this session today is ask, what comes out of basic research, which is not just patentable inventions or commercializable products? What does this narrative about basic research as the long and winding road to application not really give us? And so this is the question that we'll be posing to our panelists today. And to start us off, I'll offer one example of my own, of something that I think is not really captured by this discourse about what basic research is. So, what does basic research produce aside from just products? Well, the answer that I will give you is infrastructures. It produces infrastructures that fuel future research and discoveries, infrastructures that far outlive the particular scientific projects that those infrastructures were built for. So one example that illustrates this really well, I think, is the Cornell High Energy Synchrotron Source, or CHESS, which is what you see in this image here. And you've got a nice picture here of Nobel Prize winner Hans Bethe riding his bike around the inner ring of the synchrotron facility here. So this is a large facility that required a huge investment in public resources to build this thing up. The structure you can't really tell here, aside from the fact that it's large enough that you bike around it, but it goes under a substantial portion of Cornell's campus. It occupies a whole lot of space. Originally, this project here, CHESS, this facility, is constructed to do research in particle physics. But in the process of setting up the facility and building the infrastructure here to do that research, one of the byproducts of accelerating those electrons around this ring at very high speed is that it produces very powerful X-rays. And biologists on campus, once they realized that there was a source of high energy X-rays here, began to think about the ways in which it might be useful for their research, as well as for the research of the particle physicists. And so biologists and chemists begin using this infrastructure here as a source of X-rays to do protein crystallography, which is essentially a way of trying to infer or guess the structure of small molecules like viruses or proteins or ion channels. So this side research ended up becoming quite important within this facility. The biology that was once kind of an add-on to a mission about particle physics ended up becoming, in its own right, extremely important. So this image here is from Roderick McKinnon's Nobel Prize-winning research, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for this work in 2003, on ion channels, where he used that CHESS facility as a way of imaging these ion channels to get an idea of what their structure might look like. And you can see the little kind of teal and red flaps there, basically things that close and open the ion channel to get an idea of how it is that these regulate inflow and outflow. So the idea here that I want to convey is what was once conceptualized as a piece of equipment for answering questions in experimental physics, became, over the decades, increasingly a multi-use tool, something that many scientific communities interacted around and began to use to answer their own questions. And so if we ask what we got out of that original investment in particle physics, we'd be asking the wrong question, because we didn't just get some knowledge about particle physics as part of the mission of basic research. What we got was an investment in research that kept on giving. It built up this infrastructure that was not just useful for this one scientific question, but could be used over and over again as a source for new questions to be asked and answered. So investment in basic research is not just about the individual scientific question or mandate that's being funded, I would argue. It's in one sense about building up infrastructures, buildings, institutions, collaborative connections, and ways of thinking that power future research. Okay, so to provide us with some more questions, or some more answers rather, to this question that I posed about what comes out of basic research, I'm now going to invite up our panelists. We have three eminent basic researchers who are going to reflect on this question and what it means for them in their own work. All right, so first I will invite up Richie Davison, who is a renowned neuroscientist and one of the world's leading experts on the impact of contemplative practices, such as meditation, on the brain. He's the founder of the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds at the Weizmann Center. He's also the William James and Vilas Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry and the director of the Weizmann Laboratory for Brain Imaging and Behavior. He's perhaps best known for his groundbreaking research on emotion in the brain, a friend and the confidant of the Dalai Lama, which sounds pretty fun, I gotta say. He is a highly sought-after expert and speaker internationally, and Time magazine named him one of the most influential people in the world in 2006. He has published hundreds of scientific papers, edited 14 books, is a New York Times best-selling author, and he has been featured widely in the popular media, from ABC's Nightline to PBS's The Charlie Rose Show. So please welcome Richie Davison.
Thank you very much. It's really wonderful to participate in a symposium on this topic and to represent the area of the mind and the brain. William James, in his famous two-volume tome that was published in 1890, The Principles of Psychology, says in the preface to that tome that the brain is the one immediate bodily organ that underlies all of the mental operations. And he further goes on to say that the entire remainder of this two-volume tome is but a footnote to this single claim. That represents, I think, an important statement about the role of the brain in understanding the mind. And this is really where I would first like to begin in the few minutes of my remarks today, and simply underscore the value of neuroscientific research for understanding the mind, and for, if you will, an extension of that as self-understanding. We are living in an era now where neuroscientific findings are being discovered on a very regular basis. We see articles in the popular media about these kinds of findings. And one of the, I think, important consequences of this is that the notion that the brain is an organ that is built to change in response to experience is something that is becoming much more widely appreciated. And I think that over the years, if we go back to the 1950s to the present and look at the role of scientific information about exercise and the physical body and nutrition, there's been an increase in public awareness of the role of these kinds of factors in the self-care of our own body, if you will. And much of this came from basic research. And I think a similar trend may be occurring with respect to neuroscientific research and understanding of the mind and understanding of the role that various factors in our environments play in shaping our brain. We now know from modern evidence that playing a video game for as short as 1.5 hours can induce a measurable structural change in the brain. This kind of information, I think, gives one pause and helps us to appreciate the notion that everything we do, the interactions that we have, and I often say that our brains are constantly being shaped wittingly or unwittingly. And most of the time, I think it's fair to say that our brains are being shaped unwittingly. And simply knowing that our brains are shaped in this way may be an invitation to take more responsibility for the shaping of our own brains and shift that ratio a little bit from unwitting to more wittingly shaping of our brains. I wanted to also make a comment that was really introduced by our last speaker in her wonderful overview about the distinction between basic research and applied research, and underscoring something that was said, which is that this distinction is not at all a black and white distinction. It's really very much on a continuum. And I think that there are ways in which fundamental basic neuroscientific research has led to specific kinds of intervention studies, where interventions that target specific brain circuits, either pharmacologically or with other kinds of methods, can actually be used to test fundamental theories and fundamental concepts in neuroscience. And so if we hypothesize, for example, that a particular brain circuit involving the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex has something to do with individual differences in the deployment of attention, if we can somehow tweak these neural circuits, either pharmacologically or with methods like transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a way to actually stimulate circuits non-invasively, or through behavioral methods, some kind of training, and actually test to see if the change in these prefrontal and parietal circuits leads to a change in behavior. This is the kind of research that is both applied and basic. It's basic in that it is answering some fundamental questions about the role of specific neural circuits in particular types of behavior, and it actually can potentially provide some benefit. So the image that I have up on the screen was a picture that was actually taken in our lab that somehow appeared on the cover of the March 2005 issue of National Geographic. And it depicts an unusual study that we did here at the University of Wisconsin, which really was one of these kind of crossover studies. It was very much a basic research study looking at the fundamental neural activity associated with specific kinds of mental states in the grand tradition of William James, but it did it in people who have undergone certain kinds of training to exercise their mind, to see if that kind of training actually resulted in patterns of brain activity that were different from individuals who did not undergo that kind of training. And the findings, again, are findings that I think are relevant to our basic understanding of the neural basis of mental activity, but also have very important applied implications, because they raise the possibility that we can actually train our brain by transforming our mind using specific types of behavioral strategies. And so this distinction between basic and applied research is undergoing some blurring in certain areas of neuroscience in ways that I actually think will be good for both the basic research community and also good for humanity in underscoring the value of certain kinds of interventions that can change the mind and the brain in ways that may be beneficial. So I'll end here, and I'm sure we'll have more discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, our second panelist is John Hawks, who is the Vilas Borghese Distinguished Achievement Professor of Anthropology here at UW-Madison. He's done fieldwork in Africa, Europe, and Asia on fossil hominins, and he is best known for his work on the recent rapid genetic evolution of our species, including our genetic mixture with Neanderthals. Since 2013, he's been part of the Rising Star Project, which has recently published a description of a new hominin species, which I'm sure you guys have probably seen news coverage of. He's also been a leader in public communication of research. His weblog is a top international resource on human evolution and genetics. And in 2014, he taught a MOOC that brought students around the world virtually into the field. With the help of his Rising Star Project, has for the first time enabled people to follow along with the excavation of fossils as it happened. All right, welcome, John Hawks.
Well, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming out. There's my slide, hominileti. Everything I do is basic research. I don't do applied research. I will never cure anybody of anything, and there's not anything. There's no directive from my lab that is, do something that's useful. What we do is try to uncover the relationships of humans and the events that led to our present existence. Our evolutionary history is the one thing that every human on Earth shares. We share a genealogy from this history. We're relatives, and our relationships stem from events that are no longer evident to us. And so we use the fossil record and we use evidence from genetics to try to uncover those. We think that it's important because it's the thing that ties us all together. Wherever we live in the world, we're part of this history. And certainly discovering things that bring that history to life has been enormous in showing people everywhere in the world how they're connected together. So, as I'm describing what is fundamentally basic research that has no practical application, as you can see, the way that it affects people suddenly becomes a practical application. I'll tell a story about discovery. The history of discovering fossil hominins in Africa is fundamentally a history of gold mining. Gold mining in the 19th century in southern Africa began around Johannesburg. Johannesburg today is built on top of gold mines that were started there in the 1850s and 60s. And the growth of that city was tied to the growth of gold mining and the extractive ability, which continually increased through technology. Shortly after the turn of the century, the extractive technology the last century, the extractive technology that became common was the cyanide process that enabled the separation of gold from ore at very high efficiency. The entire southern tier of Johannesburg is covered in the spoils from cyanide processing of gold ore, these giant pyramids of this cyanide-laced stuff, many of which were early in this process, and we've become more efficient. And so today, gold companies are going back through those spoils to get the residual gold out of them. Well, to do the cyanide process, you need a ready source of alkali. And what people did in those days was take their mule teams up to the north, where dolomite formations were. They weren't gold-bearing formations at all, but they were full of caves. And the caves were full of calcite in a very pure form, and they would mine that calcite by blasting. They'd bring out the stalagmites and stalactites and flowstones. They would build kilns to burn it and create lime, and that lime was used industrially for gold mining. In that process, they uncovered spoils from those caves, which were unwanted to the miners, but those spoils were full of fossils. And it was in picking through these spoils that boys started to collect fossils. And ultimately, an anatomist named Raymond Dart said, "Hey guys, you're finding fossils. If you ever find anything interesting, would you please send it to me? I'll pay for it." And one day in 1923, he receives a package in the mail that has the first known fossil hominin ever discovered in Africa, the Tong child. It became one of the most famous fossils ever discovered. In the subsequent 95-year history of exploration of human origins, basically this one discovery was exploited again and again. We're going to look through the spoils of places where people have blasted for things, and we're going to look for these fossils. And the places where there's lots of lime are where we're going to look for fossils. In around 2005, my friend Lee Berger decided that there was maybe they could apply technology to look for things in a better way. And so he looked at Google Earth, which was just starting then, and he said, I know this landscape in what it became known as the cradle of humankind. I know where the caves are. I can see where the caves are on Google Earth. But these caves on Google Earth seem to be associated with, there's always this sort of cluster of trees around it, and it tended to be a yellowwood tree. And he said, wow, I see lots of those on the Google Earth maps. Why don't I walk and see if these are really caves? And he started to systematically explore. This was the first systematic exploration for fossil sites in South Africa using anything other than, hey, we found fossils here before. In the immediate wake of that, he found this fossil, Australopithecus sediba, at what was once a cave and is no longer much of a cave. It's sort of a hole in the ground that's full of breccia. That breccia has an unusual concentration of hominin fossils, up to 6 individuals now, and represented a species that was previously unknown to science. Some of the most complete skeletons ever discovered. This was a function of exploring in a new way. We're continuing that process of exploring in a new way in southern Africa. In underground exploration. A team of cavers who were working with Lee to explore deep underground, where sometimes fossils are found, stumbled upon this assemblage of bones in 2013. What has become known as Homo naledi was found in the Rising Star Cave, a cave that had never had any fossils identified in it before. But by systematic exploration underground, a new source of fossils was discovered. Fossils that are not brecciated in a hard rock, as we often find in southern Africa, fossils that are lying loose on the floor of a cave and in a clay-like soil matrix. They represent a species that we hadn't ever found before, and one that's very primitive in its anatomy. They show us something that's fundamentally new, and it's only because we started looking for things systematically in a new way. We now have exploration teams, including some of the original cavers, but a lot of other people who've been trained in the field all the time. And they have already found additional fossil hominin sites that we're now working on. The basic exploration and basic research process, the one that begins with discovery in our field and that leads its way through the analysis of the bones, the scientific description of them, the comparison of bones with everything else that we've ever found before so that we can highlight their place in our evolutionary tree, and second and third phase research projects. For example, this collection of bones includes the bones of at least 15 individuals, at least 8 of them are juveniles. We've never had a collection like this representing neonates up to old adults in every age of child. That collection will enable us to do research on the process of development in this fossil hominin population, a pattern of data that we have never had before for any species before Neanderthals. So this becomes suddenly an incredible source of information that leads to more basic research on the way that we became human, not because Homo naledi is necessarily our direct ancestor, but because it represents a relative of ours that presents unique data that we don't have for any other relative. And as we discover more sites, as we move from the second dimension in space underground into these different areas underground, as we discover more and more, we will build new data sets like this. So what I guess is the message is that it takes something as simple as being willing to look in places that people haven't looked before. And you can expect a lot of failure when you do that. You know, Lee spent years walking over the cradle not finding anything interesting, but he had some nice walks. And it was the discovery of sediba that really showed that this had great promise. And then as we systematize that, as we build a larger team, as we're bringing in people to do the analysis, you start to see that this really changes the science. And that's, to me, the value of basic research.
Thank you for that nice description of the network of basic research that supports discoveries. All right, and our third panelist for today is Judith Kimball, who is Vilas Professor in the Department of Biochemistry here at UW-Madison, and also holds appointments in the Laboratory of Genetics, the Laboratory of Cell and Molecular Biology, and the Department of Cell and Regenerative Biology. It's probably a lot of meetings to go to. Kimball has received numerous awards and honors over the years and has served the biomedical research community in various capacities. She was awarded a position as an investigator in the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in 1994, which she has held since that time, and most recently, President Obama asked her to chair his Committee on the National Medal of Science. Please welcome Judith Kimball.
So now for something a little different. So I wasn't actually thinking of this as talking about my own research, which of course is very basic and which I could talk about, but I wanted to broaden this conversation to think about what is the rationale for basic research. Because I really feel that this is under attack now. A lot of people out there with power and money think that the days of basic research are gone, and now we can just apply what we know to more translational problems. And so the funding for basic research has gone downhill, and I think that we really have to fight this, and this is what I wanted to describe here. So this is really my view of basic research as an explosion. This is kind of the concept of trying to think of what basic research is. It's a source that brings light. It is a source that brings surprise. And rather than trying to study a problem, so for example, Professor Davison talked about how you start by trying to understand the brain. One of the things that I find most amazing about basic research is that you can start by thinking about one thing and discover something that has completely different ramifications. And my favorite example of this, and it's favorite because it's really transforming science right now, and it's something that's just happened, is the application of a discovery that was made over 3 decades, 1987 to today, in which it was found that bacteria, how bacteria remember who their invaders are. That's, people studying this, people were sequencing DNA in bacteria. This is basic research. They discovered the elements of this. They didn't recognize them at first. Once they recognized them, then they figured out the mechanism. And just in 2014, they figured out that they could use the mechanism to edit any genome. So it went from trying to understand how a bacteria evaded its invaders and remembered who it was going to a tool that can be used to edit a human genome, a cell, a guinea pig genome, any genome, and do it. This is something that those of us who've been working in this field forever have wanted to do forever. And now all of a sudden we have this magical tool. It totally transforms biological research. And so we're at the precipice now of a whole new era where we can do things that we never knew we could do before. And yet basic research is getting underfunded. And this is not, of course, the only discovery out there. There are a lot of other discoveries out there. We don't understand so much in our natural world, and we need to be funding research that tries to understand that natural world. There's lots of examples of this. I don't know how much time I have, but so, and one more example. So there's another example in which, this is in my field, not my work, but in which there were researchers who were trying to understand the genetic regulation of the life cycle. And they went in, and what they discovered was microRNAs in a tiny little worm that nobody cared about and nobody believed it was of importance. And 10 years later, they figured out that, oh, these microRNAs are actually conserved, and there's the same actual microRNA in a human being doing the same thing, controlling its life cycle, as in a worm, a little nematode worm. And then this exploded again. This was 2001, so it's history now, but it exploded our understanding of what was going on in biology. What do we not know? There's so many things that we do not know yet. And if we are trying to train our students that they have to go off and do translational research because that's the only way they can get money, that's the wrong message. That's really the wrong message. And so one of the other things that comes out of basic research, in my view, other than these amazing surprises and discoveries that transform our world, is the training of our talent for our society, training of scientists that can go into many different walks, training of educators, and training of our citizens. And so to me, that source is also really important.
Thank you for that. All right, so we've given you some of our answers to the question of what comes out of basic research. Infrastructures, self-understanding, surprises, a source that produces many different things, from applications to students who are trained in particular styles of thinking. So what we'd like to do now for the last 10 minutes or so is open up the floor to your comments. How would you answer this question? Or to ask a question of our panelists and what you'd like to know from them about their research or the concept of basic research in general. So I think we have a microphone that's going to go around, but to get us started, a question that I had after hearing Kevin's presentation about the assumption that basic research is going to be difficult to communicate to funders or to the public. I wanted to ask you whether or not that's true in your own experience, and if it is, what techniques you found that work well for trying to convey the value of basic research to people who fall outside of the scientific community. So anyone who wants to take a stab.
When Kevin was talking about that and trying to train or educate the legislators, I wondered if WARF has a branch for training clearly the town center is a branch for training the public. What about the legislators? How can we reach out to them? I'd say.
I think that I think this is a really important question. I actually over the last maybe 5 years since basic research has really been under attack, we have had regular exercises a few times a year for graduate students and postdocs who work in my lab to help communicate in a straightforward way to non-scientists the value of the basic research in which they're engaged, and to give a kind of elevator speech. Graduate students, I find, are extraordinarily bad at doing this, and really requires practice. And I think this is a case where you really can get better if you practice. And I think it's really important that that our students learn this kind of skill, because I think it's going to increasingly be important if we are to succeed in the mission that that Judith is pleading for, which all of us clearly are passionately behind, which is to continue the support and increase the support for basic research at this time in our country.
One of the things that I find, of course, all of us are not only scientists, but also educators, and education is part of what we do. For our project, for the first time, we've been able to put the fossils in surface model form online, and we have people downloading them everywhere. And one of the things that's happening is that teachers everywhere are downloading our models and printing them, and making these 3D prints that are showing up in classrooms everywhere. To be able to have research that has just been published and is available to immediately go in a classroom is really exciting to us. And that is the sort of thing that enables us to communicate the importance of basic research, because it's getting kids into it just as fast as the research is happening.
So I'd like to, again, sort of emphasize the importance of the town center. in this exercise to try and reach out to the public, and how important the town center and how visionary the town center is, and thank WARF. You know, since this is a 90th anniversary, we should say happy birthday, but we should also thank them for doing this. My students come over here and do a lot of outreach through the town center. They have their elevator speeches as well, and those are also things that are being promoted in national societies. But having the town center as a hub, I think, is really important. So, yes.
We have some questions and comments over here. I see a couple hands. Right there, yeah.
Hi. To take the examples of research in human history and human fossils, do you think if we hadn't done any research on that, so if we didn't know at all where we come from, how different do you think, Professor Hawks, our lives and society would be?
You know, I think that understanding where we come from has had a tremendous effect on society. When you think of, you know, the situation of our knowledge, not even 150 years ago before the idea of evolution, but even 50, 60 years ago, you know, before people started to investigate the behavior of wild primates, and humans were thought to be the only tool users, and we were thought to be very separate from the other apes. And all of the research that has gone into human genetics, which was in large part, you know, combined, applied, and basic in intention, we're going to do things for human health. But as a consequence, we learn what our relationship to other primates is, and the things that we share with them, and the fact that we're 99% identical, and the ways in which we are different are focused not on the coding sequences of genes, but the regulatory sequences of genes. You know, those sorts of discoveries that contribute to basic knowledge of how human biology works, and in real terms, our connection to other organisms, the way that we've developed as a species comes from this history, have fundamentally transformed the way that we think about the workings of human biology. So I think that there's a cycle here which continually readjusts our knowledge of how special we are, or the ways in which we're special, not only relative to other creatures, but also relative to other human populations. You know, 50, 60 years ago, it was not assumed that humans everywhere in the world were genetically almost identical. Today we know that that's true. Those realizations have really transformed, I think, the way that we think about humanity.
Yeah. Can I also throw in that when I wrote my first NIH R01, I wrote this line, which I did not believe, which was that the research I was planning to do would have some relevance to human disease. I wrote it in there because I was supposed to write it in there. And one of the things I've learned over 30 years, that everything I've done has been relevant to human disease. It's amazing how time after time, discoveries that we've made in very simple creatures have preceded similar discoveries in vertebrates, sometimes by as much as 20 years, and that can lead the thinking. So again, I think that's my view has changed. You were asking how views are changed. My view has changed by understanding that our building blocks are all the same, and we're all basically, you know, the creatures that are being regulated in much the same way. Our brains are similar. You can get ideas, basic principles of how the brain functions from a nematode worm. Amazing, right? But it's true, and that changes the way you think, and as does this work.
I think there was another question somewhere around here. At the end? Yeah?
Yeah, I'd like to relate a story about my career. I came to Madison in 1971 as a member of the McCardle Laboratory for Cancer Research. I'm not a cancer researcher, but I had made some important discoveries in gene regulation. At that time, Richard Nixon had declared war on cancer and put a lot of money into cancer research. Much later, people said, you know, that was sort of a failure. We didn't cure cancer with all that money. But what that money did was and the reason was we didn't know anything about the body or how cells worked. And so then there was this long period of time, which is now, I think, coming to fruition, when we studied and studied and studied how cells work, how tissues work, how organs work, how organisms work. Now we understand it well enough to be able to figure out how to intervene in a cancer cell, which is a normal cell that's gone haywire. And it's an amazing thing. I mean, people in 71 thought everything had been discovered. My students said, well, all the low-hanging fruit is gone. and if you look at the major things in biology and cell biology that have happened in the last 45 years, we didn't know anything in 1971, or very little. Now we know a lot, and we're in a position to design molecules that can interfere with almost anything. Not everything, but many things. I like to think of it as basic research on applied problems. You have to understand what you're doing in order to come up with something that might be useful. But just one more thing, there's a book, and I'm sorry I don't remember the author, but the title is called Pasteur's Quadrant. And this book says, you don't think of applied and basic as being two ends of a line. You bend the line, and now you can look at things that are very... I can't do it. I only have two hands. You have a thing like this, and this is this is applied practicality, and this is contribution to basic knowledge. And somebody like Thomas Edison was really good at solving practical problems, but he didn't, to the first approximation, discover new principles. The person who really did it was Louis Pasteur. He did incredible amount of basic research, but he also solved problems. How to cure, how to make vaccines, how to prevent wine from going bad. But he had to understand it at the practical level. So anybody who's interested in this question should read this book called Pasteur's Quadrant.
As a segue to the next topic in this series, I'd just like to say that there's almost no difference between research and discovery. I think of research as a discovery science, and so I was kind of surprised to see those up there, and I think that you've heard about lots of discoveries here today. So remember that when you come back next week.
That's a good segue, thank you. So maybe as a way of wrapping up the session, instead of providing a summary, I'll provide a closing thought. So we titled the session The Value of Basic Research, and we've given you a bit of an idea of where that term came from. So the question I'll leave you with is, has that term run its course? We've had it now for 60 years. It did some good work. Is it time to stop talking about basic research and applied research and just talk about research, or to give it a different designator that gives you a different idea about what the value of that work is? So we've tried to give you a little bit of a vocabulary here for how it is that you could talk about basic research and what comes out of it, which is not just products, and why it is that we should value those other things that are hidden by that discourse. So I hope that helps you all to think about not only basic research differently, but to talk to other people about it differently as well. So before I invite you to thank our panelists, I will remind you that you are welcome to join us for a reception afterwards in the atrium here. So let's give our speakers a round of applause and then go share in a drink.
Before we break up, we would be remiss if we didn't congratulate WARF today for beating Apple in court.
Yeah. I think we can all drink to that. Yeah.